Lecture 26, The Song of Roland.
Welcome to the second of our lectures on the literature of the European Middle Ages. In this lecture, we're going to consider the stately Song of Roland, La Chanson de Roland, which stands at the beginning of French literature. Now, this is, ostensibly, a legendary account of Charlemagne's wars in Spain against Muslim adversaries. It's a book with a long and influential history. In the 19th century, for instance, the forces of nationalism and romanticism in France saw Roland an ideal statement of the French national character. The book was read as avidly by school children as by military officers in the military academies. Now, the form, the content, and the origins of the poem are somewhat mysterious, and they've occasioned a good deal of controversy. Once again, we don't know the author. We have some pretty good ideas about the date. We'll have more to say about that in a moment. But there are problems and mysteries, as we saw with Beowulf. Roland is an epic, a long narrative poem on military themes, composed in elevated language, marked by a seriousness of tone, and universalizing in its themes. It's not personal, it's not all about me, it's things that are always and everywhere true. Structurally, the poem is organized into 291 laisses, that is to say, stanzas, of varying length, ranging from 10 or a dozen lines to as many as about 30. Each line has 10 syllables, with a pause, usually right in the middle, called a caesura. Now, the lines in Roland are characterized by assonance, that is to say, the rhyming of vowel sounds, always between the two halves of a line, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, carried all the way through an entire laisse. You'll remember that Beowulf is alliterative, so that consonant sounds alliterate, echo themselves, we might say. Here, assonance, vowel sounds echo. The poem itself is organized into 4 great scenes that mirror each other beautifully. It opens with Ganelon's betrayal of Roland and concludes with Ganelon's trial. In the middle are Roland's death in battle against the Muslim forces and Charlemagne's avenging of Roland and his companions. Now, the narrative in Roland generally runs right straight through the story. There's not much in the way of flashbacks or digressions, so here the poem is different from Beowulf. The narrator, like the Beowulf poet, adopts a stance of personal detachment. He doesn't pretend to be an eyewitness. That was then, this is now. Once again, he is sort of above the fray. Interest and emphasis are maintained inside the poem by dramatic shifts in the pace and rhythm of the narration. Some developments are narrated very, very quickly. I mean, in some cases, we'd actually like to have somewhat more details. But when the poet really wants us to focus on something, he calms down, he slows down, and occasionally he uses what specialists in Old French literature called parallel or similar laisses. That is to say, he virtually repeats himself. Now, there's a number of instances of this. If you have a text of the Song of Roland at your disposal, laisse 80 and 81, for example, when Oliver sees the Muslim forces approaching, or 83 to 85, when Oliver asks Roland to sound his horn, his olifant, to summon Charlemagne. Laisse 171 to 76, Roland's death scene. 209 to 211, Charlemagne's mourning for Roland. There are other examples too, but these are particularly good ones. Now, the point of these similar or parallel laisses is not that the poet just repeated himself. It creates the air, it creates the impression that a particular scene, a particular moment, a particular development is being viewed from a series of perspectives. It's really a quite interesting narrative device. Now, Roland survives in about 6 manuscripts, of which the earliest and best, the one that is generally known, is the Oxford manuscript. This manuscript was written in the 12th century. Again, paleographers can date the handwriting. It's written in the 12th century. And it is thought to contain a poem that was composed about 1100. Now, there are lots of internal hints in the poem that point to a date around 1100. Specialists in the history of the French language can point to a time around 1100, but we don't know that for sure. The thing doesn't come with a date stamp on the back of the in the back of the book, so to speak. Now, the content of the poem is at once perfectly clear and thoroughly puzzling. Okay? On the face of it, we're presented with a 200-year-old Charlemagne who has been fighting in Spain for 7 years and who has grown weary of the war. Well, right away, we know we've got something curious here, something epic, something legendary. In fact, we have, and this is very unusual, we have an epic whose historical kernel is actually known. Under the year 778, from other sources we actually could pin the date down to August 15th. The Royal Frankish Annals, which were written in about the year 790 at the court of Charlemagne, and then revised in about the year 814, report as follows. On the heights of the Pyrenees, the Basques prepared an ambush, and they threw the whole army into confusion. Although the Franks were obviously their betters in arms and valor, they nevertheless suffered a defeat, due to the unfavorable terrain and unequal method of fighting. In this engagement, a great many officers of the palace, whom the king had given positions of command, were killed. The baggage was plundered, and the enemy was able to vanish in all directions because he knew the lay of the land. To have suffered this wound shadowed the king's view of his success in Spain. A little later, in the 820s, a man by the name of Einhard, who wrote a very famous biography of Charlemagne, added a few details. He says, the Basques laid their ambush right on the tops of the mountains. The area is especially suited to ambushes because of the dense and very deep forests. They fell upon the last part of the baggage train and those who were protecting the troops at the very back of the column, as well as those who had gone ahead into the valley below. Having joined with them in combat, the Basques killed practically every one of the Franks. Protected by night, which was just falling, they snatched up the baggage and as quickly as possible scattered in every direction. The Basques were much assisted in this battle by the lightness of their arms and the lay of the land, whereas the heaviness of their arms and the unevenness of the land rendered the Franks utterly unequal to the Basques. Among many others who fell in this battle were Egihard, the seneschal, Anselm, the count of the palace, and Roland, the prefect of the Breton March. Here is Roland. But in the Song of Roland, composed some 300 years after the event, Charlemagne is fighting a crusade-like war against Muslims. So where does our poem come from? How do we get, so to speak, from Basque terrorists to a virtual crusade? That is one of the great puzzles in dealing with the Song of Roland. Now, in the 12th and 13th centuries, some 100 or so epics were composed, largely in France, on the age of Charlemagne. There was this period of Charlemagne's reign. Charlemagne was born in about 747, 748. He became king in 768. He died in 814. So that's the period. By the 12th century, this had become the legendary past. This had become the age of heroes. Now, some of these epics treated Charlemagne himself. Others of them treated various of his historical or legendary companions. Now, we normally call these kinds of epics chansons de geste, songs of deeds, all right? So that they are accounts of great and heroic deeds. Now, the scholars who study these epics tend to fall into one of two camps. We may label the one traditionalist. We may label the other individualist. Traditionalists believe that stories or songs were composed very close in time to the actual people and events portrayed in them, and that these early versions, handed down orally, stand behind Roland, or indeed other of the epics to which I was referring a moment ago. Individualists, on the other hand, believe that the Roland poet prepared an original work, even though it may well be based on older stories or older traditions, but it is an original work. Much turns, as with Beowulf, on the position one takes with respect to theories of oral formulaic composition. And of course, these kinds of theories affect also how one understands, let's say, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Do we imagine here poems composed orally, more or less on the spot, or do we imagine literary compositions. I take the view that Roland, even though it contains hundreds of formulas, one of the things that is customary in epic poetry are formula expressions, little groups of 2, 3, 4 words that recur again and again and again. So, even though Roland has hundreds of these, I think it is essentially an original composition. But it was meant to be performed. It was not meant to be read. It was meant to be performed. So, every performance, in a way, would have been new and distinctive, and all of those medieval performances of Roland are lost to us forever. Now, the Oxford version is only one. Many scholars would say that it's the finest of the Roland versions that we have, but it is only one. Now, another interesting point here is to say that Roland was meant to be sung, not read, and we have no clue, none, about the music, about the melody. We don't know what Roland sounded like when it was recited. All right, enough with preliminaries. What is this epic about? How may we summarize it? Now, it's about 4,002 lines long, so it's a bit longer than Beowulf, by nearly 1,000 lines, 800 lines perhaps. I mentioned a moment ago that it's divided really into 4 great scenes. The betrayal of Roland by Ganelon and Ganelon's trial at the end, and Roland's death and his avenging by Charlemagne in the middle. So let's take those sort of 4 developments in the order in which the poet gives them to us. The action opens when King Marsili, the Muslim commander in Spain, assembles a council of 20,000 men. Now remember, this war has been going on for 7 years. One of his key officers, Blancandrin, offers a treacherous plan. Marsili should sue for peace. He should offer to come to Aachen, Charlemagne's capital, to be baptized a Christian, and to offer noble hostages. Now, on this plan, Charlemagne will leave Spain. Marsili then will not deliver on his promises. Yes, the hostages will be slain, but Spain will be at peace, and intelligence having told them that Charlemagne has grown weary of this war, the odds are very good he's not going to come back and start it all up again. The scene shifts to Charlemagne's camp. Marsili's envoys have just arrived. They find an old and weary Charlemagne. They present him with their plan, and he's a bit dubious. Not surprisingly, Charlemagne now consults with his key advisors. Roland urges that the offer be refused. Out of hand. Keep fighting. Fight on to victory. Ganelon ridicules Roland's advice. Says there's no reason for any more Christians to die. Too much has been invested in this war. All that has been gained has been gained. Nothing further can be accomplished. Nemes, Charlemagne's most trusted advisor, also urges acceptance of the peace offer, although on somewhat more moderate terms, perhaps, than Ganelon had done. Well, one after another, Charlemagne's greatest warriors come forward and offer to go as an emissary to carry the terms of peace back to Marsili, which would mean basically conclude the negotiations. Charlemagne refuses each one of them in turn. It'd be very interesting to know exactly what we're supposed to understand by that. I mean, one after another, these guys come up and say, well, we'll go back to Marsili's camp and carry the terms of the peace. And Charlemagne says, no, not you, no, not you, no, not you. Well, maybe the next bit of the scene is being set up. Roland then nominates his stepfather, Ganelon. Now, it's interesting that these two characters being so central to the poem, this relationship is just dropped in, a little factoid, and it's never explained. We don't really know anything about this relationship or the family relationships or Roland's family or Ganelon's family or anything else. But the hint here, of course, is that these men have some sort of kinship between them. Anyway, Roland nominates Ganelon to go to Marsili. Now, has he done this out of spite of some kind? Did he think he was honoring Ganelon in some way? How are we supposed to understand this? Well, the poet doesn't tell us. Well, interestingly enough, Charlemagne accepts this nomination. You know, one after another, his great warriors come up and said, I'll go, I'll go, I'll go. And Charlemagne said, no, not you, no, not you, no, not you. Ganelon is nominated by Roland, and Charlemagne says, that's a great idea. You go, Ganelon. Well, Ganelon is furious. He thinks he may be going off to his death. He has no idea what fate holds in store for him. Nevertheless, Ganelon does go down to Marsily's camp, and he plots with him the destruction of Roland. Ganelon persuades Marsily that Charlemagne will never abandon the war as long as Roland remains alive. Well, Ganelon is rewarded handsomely, and he's sent back to Charlemagne, ostensibly to accept the terms of the peace. Well, Ganelon returns, the negotiations are concluded, Charlemagne accepts the terms that have been proposed, but he has to appoint someone to protect his rearguard as the army is marching through the mountain passes, those very passes that were described in the Royal Frankish Annals and also by Einhard. Ganelon nominates Roland. Well, of course, you see, Ganelon has plotted with Marsily to bring Roland to his doom. The next great scene shifts to Roland in Spain as the army has begun its traverse out of Spain and over the Pyrenees. Roland is with his great companions, Oliver and the lordly Archbishop Turpin, and they come to the realization that they've been betrayed, that Marsily's vast forces are approaching. Oliver 3 times asks Roland to sound his olifant, to sound his horn, to summon Charlemagne, to bring Charlemagne back, to protect them, to fight the forces of Marsily that are marching down on them. Roland refuses to do so. He feels that to do so would dishonor himself and dishonor his family name. Well, the battle is joined, and as is typical of great military epics, we have on the one hand a scene of kind of mass fog of war, battle going on a vast field, sort of undifferentiated action, and we have one great single combat after another, one great Muslim warrior and one great Frankish warrior. Little by little, the Franks are killed. Each one, of course, killing countless Muslims before expiring. One swing of the sword brings down 100 men and that sort of thing. In a very touching scene, actually, a mortally wounded Oliver strikes by mistake at Roland. Then they realize the error and they embrace and have a very touching scene shortly before Oliver dies himself. Sensing the inevitable, finally, Roland blows his horn. Now he blows it so hard that he bursts his temples, lays his sword under himself so that it won't fall into enemy hands, lays down and dies. Now it's interesting, no enemy blow killed Roland. We shift then to the third great scene of the poem. Charlemagne has heard the sound of Roland's olifant. He knows now that there has been betrayal. This is the only possible explanation. He turns his army and heads back to Spain. He comes upon the scene of the battle and sees the utter destruction, and he grieves deeply for all of his fallen comrades. He leaves some of his men there to attend to the dead, and then sets off in hot pursuit of the Muslims. Now at this point, we're introduced to a man named Baligant, the emir of Babylon, from whom Marsily had, we are told, long ago requested aid. Well, now finally Baligant shows up with his aid. The point here, of course, is that now Charlemagne is not only going to defeat Marsily's forces, he's going to defeat the forces of the emir of Babylon as well. Well, there is a majestic battle, and of course, Charlemagne wins. This brings us then to the final scene. We're back in Aachen. The forces have returned home. Now, Ganelon, it must be said, had already been arrested before Charlemagne returned to Spain. In other words, when Charlemagne realized that Roland had been betrayed, he knew that, of course, Ganelon was the only person who could have arranged the betrayal, and therefore he has him placed under arrest. So back in Aachen, Ganelon's trial is held. Ganelon tries an interesting gambit. He says that he has not betrayed Charlemagne. He has only avenged his own betrayal by Roland. He was only recouping his own honor. Now, some of the nobles around Charlemagne argued, well, perhaps it would be best at this point if all were forgiven and forgotten. Just let's put this behind us. Others argued that Ganelon's betrayal had been so great that he simply had to be punished. Well, a trial by combat is decided upon. Now, trials by combat did actually happen in the Middle Ages, but they're much more commonly portrayed in literature than in life. But in any case, in this instance, Ganelon chose the great warrior Pinabel to represent him in the trial by battle. Roland's cause was to be upheld by the totally outclassed Thierry. Well, predictably perhaps, and miraculously, Thierry prevails. Pinabel is bested, and so the verdict has fallen. Now Ganelon and 30 of his kinsmen are executed. And as the poem ends, Bramimonda, who was Marsily's queen, who had been captured in Spain, embraces Christianity. That's a very interesting closure to the poem. We'll come back to that point in just a few minutes, but it is quite interesting to notice that that's where the story ends. It doesn't end with Ganelon's execution, and thus in some sense requiting the debt of Roland's death by betrayal, but rather with Bramimonda. Now, how do we understand the poem? How might contemporaries have understood it? This is the sort of thing that is particularly engaging with Roland because, like Beowulf, the poet adopts this stance of being above the fray. He's just telling his story. That was then. This was in the old days. So we cannot be absolutely certain that the poet wants us to think one thing or another. What we can see is that he presents us with a lot of interesting challenges, interesting tensions, interesting paradoxes, interesting contrasts. Clearly, he wants us to think about these, though it's not quite clear how he wishes us to resolve them. For instance, one great critical theme in the poem is Oliver versus Roland. That is to say, prudence versus recklessness. Now, a chivalric knight was supposed to be brave, he was supposed to be courageous, he was supposed to be loyal, he was supposed to be generous, he was supposed to be pious. In the ideal world, that's what a perfect knight would be. But one of the interesting questions that the poem raises for us is, did Roland carry courage, bravery, past the point of reason? Was he reckless? And was Oliver, who urged him, remember, not once, not twice, 3 times, to sound his Oliphant and bring Charlemagne back, was Oliver the voice of reason? And then, interestingly enough, when we imagine again that debate before Charlemagne, some of those warriors said, we must stop fighting and go home. Some of those warriors said, we must fight on until final victory, or at least until the war is ended on the best terms we can get. So we have this sense that there's a kind of an interesting tension here, you see, between recklessness and prudence, reason and courage. How much courage is too much courage? How much courage is too much courage? The poet doesn't resolve that problem for us, but he certainly lays it out very clearly. Another theme centers on Roland himself and the question of démesure. Now, this is a term that actually appears in Old French texts and then is used by modern scholars to ask whether Roland is, to put it quite literally, in a rather ugly formulation, is he dismeasured? Is he out of measure? Is he himself sort of out of whack? Now, I said a moment ago, one great theme is prudence and recklessness. And that's kind of played out, the debate before Charlemagne, Roland and Oliver. But the question of Roland's démesure is actually played out within his own character. Does he show the kind of reason, the kind of intelligence, the kind of craftiness that makes for a good man and a good soldier and a good vassal, and so on? It's a very interesting problem here. How are we to understand Roland? Now, Roland is not by any stretch of the imagination, let us say, so interesting a character as Achilles in the Iliad. But you remember, perhaps, how the Iliad begins, sing, muse, the wrath of Achilles. And so that poem, in a way, the Iliad, in a way, asks us whether Achilles' behavior was just or not. The Roland poet never quite so explicitly puts the question, you see, the way, for example, Homer did, all right? But it is clear that he is inviting us to think about that question. He really wants us to reflect on this. There is, I think, an element of this as well in Beowulf, although there the characterizations are perhaps a little bit less finely drawn. Now, another important theme that is played out in the Song of Roland is the conflict between duty and honor. Ganelon, before Charlemagne, is nominated to go and bear the Franks' terms of treaty negotiations to Marsili. He feels that he has been dishonored, that he has been humiliated. Well, this is particularly interesting. This was an important and sensitive mission, not necessarily the sort of thing that would have dishonored a man. But perhaps Ganelon's dishonor comes in the fact that one warrior after another had volunteered to go, and Charlemagne had said, no, not you, and then Ganelon is nominated, and Charlemagne says, all right, fine, you can go. Had he been in some sense dishonored, his defense of himself was that he had been dishonored by Roland and had merely recouped his lost honor in betraying Roland. That he had not, he said, Ganelon said, betrayed Charlemagne. Well, obviously, in the end, though it was a close-run thing, the Franks didn't accept his argument. They accepted that Charlemagne had been dishonored. Roland, you will recall, 3 times is asked by his friend Oliver to sound his horn, to bring Charlemagne back. They can see the Muslim forces arrayed before them. They know the cause is hopeless. Now, this takes us back to prudence and recklessness and takes us back to démesure. But in this point, at this particular point, my focus is on honor. Roland's sense of his own honor. He will not blow the horn. His sense is that to the last generation, his family would be dishonored if Roland the wimp, you see, had to ask for help. Well, we're wondering here, what about Roland's duty to all those men, all those fighting men who were under his command? What about his duty to his lord and master Charlemagne? Shouldn't he have called Charlemagne back? Shouldn't he have joined battle in a way, you see, that would have perhaps turned out victoriously for the Franks? Or in any case, would not have left Roland and the entire rear guard dead on a battlefield? Where is the boundary between duty, what one owes to others, and honor, what in a sense one owes to oneself? Clearly, again, the poem plays with those themes, tweaks those issues. And again, the poet does not tell us what he wants us to think. He simply lays the issues out and invites us to think about them. Is this slice of life reality? In a world of lords and vassals, of kings and vassals, in a world of duty, in a world of honor, were these real topics, hot topics? Were these the kinds of things that in lords' halls people actually talked about, actually thought about, actually worried about? That is entirely possible. And we certainly have various historical documents that would suggest that in a way the Roland theme of duty versus honor is something that was current, that was something that was topical. Yet another theme is pragmatism and lofty ideals. Pragmatism and lofty ideals. What do I mean by this? Well, again, let us think back to that debate before Charlemagne. Some saying, we've been at this long enough, let's go home. Others have said, no, we must keep fighting. Remember at the trial of Ganelon, some are saying, look, let's just forgive and forget, let's just put this behind us, let's move on. Others saying, no, the dishonor here has been too great, the offense has been too great, Ganelon must be punished. So there is a sense of whether pragmatism is appropriate or whether lofty ideals is appropriate. The genius of the poem, perhaps, lies precisely in these kinds of tensions and paradoxes. The Muslims, for example, are presented as more than worthy foes. These are not stick figures. These are not sort of tackling dummies that are just knocked down. No, these are great warriors. In some ways, the Muslim army and the Muslim camp is a kind of a mirror image of the Frankish army and the Frankish camp. We can see other little examples of this. The Christians, of course, worship a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Muslims worship Apollo, Muhammad, and Termagant. Well, they do no such thing, but in this poem, that's the way they are. The Franks are not presented as bloodthirsty. They're not sort of a bunch of unthinking, unfeeling bubbas. They mourn their dead comrades. They want to go home. When they cross the Pyrenees and see France, sweet France, they weep. So we're presented with people who have sort of credible human feelings. Fundamentally, what we may say, by way of conclusion, is that the Song of Roland composed at the very time of the First Crusade, opens for us a vista on the social, the political, and the religious values of Europe, and also shows us the startling creativity of French literature at the moment of its birth.